cardboard box I carried out of that office weighed maybe 4 pounds. My whole nursing career, 5 years of overnight shifts, holiday schedules, the smell of antiseptic permanently worked into my skin, fit inside something I could carry with one hand. My mother didn't look up from her crossword puzzle when I walked through her front door. "You're early," she said. "I got let go." She filled in a word, 7 letters, something about rivers. "Well," she said finally, "your brother always said nursing wasn't stable." I set the box down on her kitchen table and went to pour myself a glass of water. I stood at her sink and looked out at the backyard. The same yard where I'd learned to ride a bike, where I'd done homework on summer afternoons, where I'd sat with her through 3 rounds of chemotherapy without telling a single person at work why I kept requesting schedule changes. I burned through all my PTO. I'd taken unpaid leave twice. I'd driven 2 hours each way on my days off to take her to infusion appointments because my brother lived 40 minutes away and was always too busy. The water from the tap was cold. I drank the whole glass without stopping. "I'll figure it out," I said. She had already moved on to the next clue. "My brother's name is Cordell. He's 3 years older than me, broader in the shoulders, better at remembering to call my mother on her birthday. He married a woman named Simone who has opinions about everything. Open concept kitchens, the right age to start children in sports, the correct way to load a dishwasher. She once spent 20 minutes explaining to me why my apartment building had poor resale value. I rent. Cordell and Simone lived in a 4-bedroom colonial in Fairview with a finished basement and a backyard big enough to host the 4th of July parties they threw every summer, which my mother attended and praised and talked about for weeks afterward. I'd gone to exactly 2 of those parties. Both times I'd driven myself home early because I was on a 6 a.m. shift the next morning. My mother talked about their house the way people talk about a place they've always wanted to live. She talked about their kids. My nephew Beau and my niece Priya, who Simone had named after a college roommate, with a particular softness in her voice that she didn't use for anything else. She talked about Cordell, the way mothers on television talk about sons who have exceeded every expectation. She talked about me the way people talk about a situation they're managing. I knew this. I had known it for years. It sat in my chest like a stone I'd learned to carry without adjusting my posture. She was diagnosed the first time when I was 26. Breast cancer, caught early, treatable. I moved back home for 4 months. Cordell came for Thanksgiving and stayed 3 days. The second time I was 29. The treatment was harder. She lost weight and then her hair and then her certainty about things, which was the part that scared me most because my mother had always been certain. I took a leave of absence. I slept in my childhood bedroom and learned to cook the 6 things she could stomach, and drove her to appointments, and sat in waiting rooms doing crossword puzzles from magazines I'd pulled from the rack by the check-in desk, because she liked them, and I needed something to do with my hands. Cordell sent a grocery delivery service. Twice a month, a box of things she didn't ask for and sometimes couldn't eat. He called on Sundays when he remembered. She recovered. She always said Cordell's grocery boxes had helped so much. I went back to work. I picked up extra shifts to cover what I'd spent. My father had been gone since I was 14. Not dead. Just gone. He moved to Phoenix with a woman from his office and sent cards on Christmas and my birthday, always with a check for an amount that felt like he'd calculated it to be meaningful without actually requiring thought. $50 when I was 15, $100 when I graduated high school, $200 when I finished my nursing degree, with a card that said, "So proud of you, kid," in his handwriting, which I still recognized even after all those years. He died in February, 2 years ago. He left behind a will. My mother told me about it in the way she told me most things, indirectly, while doing something else. We were sorting through a closet when she mentioned that my father had apparently owned some property. A piece of land out near Kelton, a small town about 60 miles east of where I grew up. She said his attorney had reached out. She didn't look at me when she said it. "Property?" I said. "Some old thing. He bought it years ago before he left." I didn't even know about it until after. She handed me a box of winter coats to sort through. What kind of property? I don't know the details. She paused. Cordell thinks it's probably worth very little. These rural parcels usually are. Of course Cordell already knew. Of course they'd discussed it. Did the attorney reach out to both of us? I asked. She hesitated one beat too long. I gave her your number, she said. She should be calling. She should be calling, not she already called, and here's what she said. Should be, future tense. Which meant my mother had known about this for some time and had talked it over with Cordell before mentioning it to me. I put the winter coats in the donation pile. The attorney's name was Sandra. She had a voice like someone who gave difficult news regularly and had made peace with it. She called the following Tuesday while I was sitting in my car outside a grocery store, and she told me that my father had left me something. Not the property, or not just the property. He had left me a storage unit. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It came out wrong, too sharp, and Sandra waited for me to stop before continuing. The storage unit was in Kelton, she explained. It had been rented in my father's name for 11 years. The contents were mine. There was also a letter. A letter? I said. Yes. He asked that it be given to you with the key. Just to me? Not to my brother? Another one of those careful pauses. The letter is addressed to you, she said. The storage unit is in your name now. Your brother received the land parcel, which has been appraised. I don't need to know the appraisal, I said. I didn't. I already understood the shape of it. Cordell got the land, which my mother had already quietly told him about, which they'd already discussed, and probably already decided was the thing of value. I got a storage unit in a town I'd never visited, with a letter from a man who'd sent me birthday checks for 20 years. Okay, I said. Thank you, Sandra. I sat in the parking lot for a long time after I hung up. I drove out to Kelton on a Saturday in March, when the fields on either side of the highway were that particular grey-brown colour that comes just before anything starts growing. The storage facility was on the edge of town, past a feed store and a gas station and a diner with a handwritten specials board in the window. It was called Kelton Self-Storage. The sign was sun-faded, and one of the letters had partially fallen off, so it read, Elton Self-Storage, which felt like something. The manager was a man named Pete, who had clearly been working there a long time and had no interest in making conversation. He walked me to the unit number 114, near the back of the second row, and stood there while I used the key Sandra had mailed me. The lock opened on the first try. The door rolled up. I don't know what I expected. Boxes of old clothes, maybe. Furniture. My father hadn't wanted to deal with. The accumulated junk of a life he'd moved on from. I stood there for a moment and let my eyes adjust to the dim interior, and then I started to understand that whatever this was, it was not junk. The unit was maybe 10 by 15 feet. It was organized. That was the first thing I noticed. It was organized in a way that felt deliberate, careful, like someone had spent real time thinking about how to use the space. There were filing cabinets along the left wall, 4 of them, all labelled. There were shelves along the right wall with bankers' boxes, also labelled, dates going back decades. In the centre of the unit, on a folding table, there was a shoebox. On top of the shoebox was an envelope with my name on it. My handwriting is different from my father's. His was precise and small, the kind of handwriting that comes from engineering school. Mine is rounder, looser, but I recognised his immediately, even after all those years, the same way I'd recognised it on Christmas cards and birthday notes. Nora, he'd said. Just my name, like a door. Pete had the grace to walk back to his office and leave me alone. I sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit with my back against the wall, and I opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages handwritten on yellow legal pad paper. I'm not going to recite it word for word. Some things are too private for that, even now. But I'll tell you what it said in the way that mattered. He wrote that he knew he hadn't been there. He didn't make excuses for it. He said he'd been a coward in a way that had taken him most of his adult life to understand, and that by the time he understood it, the distance had gotten too wide to cross without. And this is the part I read 3 times, without making the crossing about himself. He didn't want to come back into my life as a reconciliation story. He said that was something men like him did for themselves, not for their kids. He said he'd watched from a distance. He used the word watched, and I sat with that for a minute because it was both generous and painful in equal measure. He said he knew what I'd done during my mother's illness, both times. He said he knew because my mother had at some point told him not to inform him. She hadn't known he was keeping track, but in the way people talk when they're processing something. She'd mentioned it to him in one of their occasional calls. He said he'd written everything down. He wrote that he had spent the last 11 years putting things into the storage unit. Not for Cordell. He said it plainly. Not for your brother. He wrote that he had watched Cordell become someone who expected the world to organize itself around his convenience, and he wrote that he recognized that person because he had been that person, and he knew what that person cost the people around him. The storage unit contained his financial records, going back 30 years, his investment accounts, policies, a deed to a small house in Kelton that he had apparently purchased 7 years ago as a rental property, separate from the land parcel he'd left Cordell, and which had been generating rental income that had been accumulating in an account in my name. An account in my name. I had to read that twice. I put down the letter and opened the shoebox. Inside was a passbook, the old kind, the kind banks barely use anymore, and a folder with account statements. I opened the folder to the most recent statement. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt when I saw that number. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the satisfaction of a story where the right person wins in the end. It was something more complicated than that, something that sat right next to grief and wouldn't quite separate from it. Because the number on that page represented 11 years of my father paying attention from a distance, and the thing is, I had wanted him to pay attention in person. I had wanted that when I was 14 and he moved to Phoenix, and I had kept wanting it in a low, quiet way for 20 years. And now he was dead, and the only version of his attention I was ever going to get was documented in a shoebox in a storage unit in a town called Kelton. But it was something, it was real. And it was mine. I sat on that concrete floor for a long time. I didn't call Cordell. I didn't call my mother. I called Sandra and told her I'd been to the unit and received the letter, and she walked me through the next steps in the same calm voice she'd used the first time. There was a process. There were documents to sign. It would take a few weeks. I drove home in the dark. I stopped at that diner I passed on the way in, the one with the handwritten specials board. I ordered coffee and eggs, and I sat at the counter and I looked out the window at the dark highway, and I thought about my father in a way I hadn't allowed myself to think about him since the Christmas card stopped. He wasn't a good father. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about a father who was secretly wonderful all along. He left. He missed things that can't be recovered. School plays and graduation, and the 2 years when I was doing terribly and needed someone to notice. He wasn't there, and then he was dead, and the absence has a shape now that it didn't have before. But he saw something near the end. He saw it, and he did something about it in the only way he apparently knew how, which was quietly and with documentation. I ate my eggs. I left a good tip. I drove home. I told my mother 3 weeks later, when the paperwork was finalized. I decided I didn't want to tell her before then. I didn't want the conversation to happen in pieces, with Cordell involved in the middle of it, with Simone's opinions coming in from the edges. We were at her kitchen table. She had coffee. I had the folder Sandra had given me, which I set down between us without opening it. Dad left me more than the storage unit, I said. She looked at the folder. Something moved across her face, not surprise exactly. Something more complicated. He told you about the letter? I asked. He told me he'd written one, she said. I didn't know what was in it. He wrote that you'd mentioned my taking care of you during your treatment. She was quiet for a moment. I might have, she said. We talk sometimes, not often. He kept records, I said. He paid attention. He set up an account. I told her the broad strokes, not the number. That felt too much like a weapon, and I didn't want to use it that way. Just the shape of it, the house, the rental income, the account that had been accumulating in my name for 11 years. She was quiet for a long time. Cordell doesn't know yet, I said. She nodded slowly. He's going to be upset, she said. I sat with that for a moment. The instinct to say, yes, I know, I'll be careful, to manage it, to smooth the edges. It was such a familiar reflex. It took me a conscious effort not to do it. Maybe, I said, but it's not mine to manage. She looked at me then, really looked the way she didn't always. No, she said, I suppose it isn't. Cordell called me on a Tuesday. He'd found out. I'm not sure how, probably through my mother, probably through the attorney process. Those things have a way of surfacing. He wasn't shouting. He was using the voice he used when he was trying to sound reasonable while being furious. The slightly too measured cadence of a man who had decided to be calm about something he was not calm about. I just want to understand, he said, why Dad would structure things that way. I think he explained it in the letter. You got a letter. I didn't get a letter. I know. A pause. That seems, he started. Cordell, I said. He stopped. You got the land, I said. It's a real parcel. It has value. He left you something. The land is worth. I don't want to compare, I said. That's not a conversation I'm going to have. Another pause. Longer. Simone thinks we should contest it, he said. I had expected that. I had sat with Sandra for almost an hour before this call, knowing Simone would think that, knowing Cordell would at least mention it. That between you and your attorney, I said, but the will is clean. Sandra was very thorough. Silence on his end. I drove 2 hours each way to take Mom to her infusion appointments, I said. Both rounds. I took unpaid leave. I changed my schedule for years. I paused. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because I think you've always known it and you've never said anything about it. And now we're in a situation where Dad did say something about it, and I understand that's uncomfortable. But it's the truth. He didn't respond right away. When he did, it was quieter. I could have done more, he said. I hadn't expected that. I didn't quite know what to do with it. Yeah, I said. You could have. I'm sorry, Nora. 2 words that took 20 years. I let them sit there for a moment without filling the space. Thank you, I said. We didn't fix everything on that phone call. I don't think you fixed 20 years in one conversation. But something shifted. Some calcified thing that had been stuck for a long time loosened slightly, and I could feel it. The house in Kelton has a tenant, a retired teacher named Mr. Hennessy, who has lived there for 4 years and keeps a very neat front porch. I met him once, briefly, when I drove out to walk the property. He shook my hand and told me my father had always fixed things promptly and he hoped I would do the same. I told him I would. I'm not sure what I'll do with the house eventually. I'm not sure what I'll do with any of it. I've been back at work, different hospital, different unit, which turned out to be an improvement in ways I hadn't anticipated. I have more time on weekends. I've been sleeping better. My mother and I have dinner on Thursdays now. This is new. We didn't have a regular thing before, but something shifted after I sat across from her at that kitchen table with Sandra's folder between us. She asks me questions now. Real ones. Not the kind that are really statements. She asked me what I'd wanted to be before nursing. I told her a marine biologist, which I had genuinely wanted at age 11 because of a documentary about the deep ocean. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her. I'm learning things about my mother that I should probably have known for years. and I'm learning them now, and I'm deciding that now is enough. It has to be. I still think about my father's letter. I've read it probably a dozen times. I think about the phrase he used, about not wanting to come back into my life as a reconciliation story, not wanting to make the crossing about himself. There's something in that I keep returning to, not because it absolved him, but because it showed me he finally understood the difference between doing something for someone and doing it so you can feel good about having done it. He figured it out too late to be there, but he figured it out. I keep the letter in the shoebox. The shoebox is on the shelf in my closet, next to my nursing school textbooks that I'd never gotten around to donating. Every few weeks I take it down and I read a page or two, and then I put it back. I don't know what I'm looking for each time. Maybe I'm just practicing something, sitting with something complicated without needing to resolve it. Loving someone who failed you without either erasing the failure or letting it be the only thing. My brother called last week, not about the estate, just a talk which he hasn't done in, honestly, I can't remember when. He mentioned that Bo had started playing baseball and that Priya was going through a phase where she only wanted to eat orange foods. He sounded the way people sound when they're trying, a little uncertain of their footing but moving forward anyway. I told him about Mr. Hennessy and his very neat porch. Cordell laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh without Simone's laugh running underneath it, setting the pitch. "Maybe I'll drive out there sometime," he said. "See the place." "Okay," I said. "Let me know." We hung up, and I stood at my kitchen window for a minute, looking out at the parking lot of my apartment building, which does have poor resale value, which I still rent, which has a window that faces east and gets good morning light. My father left me something real. He left it late, and he left it imperfectly, and he left it from a distance, but he left it. And I drove 60 miles on a grey March morning, and I sat on a concrete floor, and I read 3 pages of legal pad paper, and I found out that someone had been keeping track. That matters to me. I'm still figuring out exactly how much, but it matters. There's a version of this story where I'm bitter, where I sit across from my mother at her kitchen table and I lay out every appointment I drove, every shift I missed, every dollar I didn't earn during those 2 rounds of treatment, and I make sure everyone in the room understands exactly what was given and what was taken. I could have done that. Part of me, the tired part, the part that drove home from infusion centers in the dark, while my brother sent grocery boxes from 40 minutes away, that part wanted to. But I think about what my father wrote in that letter, about not wanting to make the crossing about himself. And I think there's a version of that instinct that applies to me too. The anger was real. The exhaustion was real. But making this story about what I was owed would have turned something true into something smaller. What I keep coming back to is this: I didn't take care of my mother because I expected a reward. I took care of her because she was sick, and she needed someone, and I was the person who showed up. That's the whole reason. And for a long time I told myself that was enough, that doing the right thing was its own justification, that I didn't need anyone to notice. What I didn't understand until I sat on that concrete floor in Kelton was that noticing matters. It matters not because we do good things in order to be seen, but because being seen is what tells us we aren't alone in it. My father saw. He saw from a distance, imperfectly, too late to be present for any of it. But he saw, and he wrote it down. And he did something. That act of witness changed something in me that I'm still sorting through. Cordell said he was sorry. 2 words after 20 years. I've been thinking about what it takes to say something like that, to look at a version of events you've been comfortable with and decide to revise it. That's not a small thing. It's actually the harder thing than showing up when it's easy. It requires a kind of honesty about yourself that most people spend a lifetime avoiding. I don't know yet what we're building from that phone call, but I know something shifted, and I'm choosing to believe that shifts matter even when they come late. I've been a nurse long enough to know that the body doesn't heal all at once. It heals in layers, slowly, and sometimes the process is uncomfortable. And sometimes you can't tell it's working until suddenly something moves that didn't move before. I think families are like that too. I think I'm like that too. What this year has taught me, the job loss, the storage unit, the letter, all of it, is that integrity isn't something you perform for an audience. It's what you do when you're driving home at midnight from a hospital 2 hours away and no one is watching and you're going back the next morning anyway. It's what accumulates quietly. The way rental income accumulates in an account you didn't know existed. The way trust builds in someone who's paying attention, even when you've given up on being seen. And wisdom, I think, is learning to tell the difference between the peace that comes from giving up and the peace that comes from understanding. I spent a long time confusing the two. I still have the letter. I read it sometimes. I'm still figuring out exactly what I owe a man who failed me and then finally tried. But I know what I owe myself. I showed up. I kept going. And it turned out someone was keeping track.